The United States Camel Corps stands as one of the most unusual and least known experiments in the entire history of the American military. In the mid-19th century, the U.S. Army made a serious decision to deploy camels as pack animals across the Southwest, in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The idea was straightforward. Real ships of the desert could carry supplies through terrain that broke horses and mules, scorching desert flats, scarce water sources, and vast, empty stretches of land where nothing else could survive. At first glance, the whole thing sounds like a punchline, but behind it stood serious military calculations, significant government money, and men who would go on to become some of the most recognizable figures in American history. Here's the paradox. The experiment turned out to be far more successful than people generally assume. The camels handled the heat beautifully, had no trouble with long marches, could go without water far longer than mules, and carried 2, sometimes nearly 3 times the load. And yet the project still ended in failure. Horses were terrified by the smell of the unfamiliar animals. Soldiers hated dealing with their stubborn temperament. Politicians gradually lost interest in the costly experiment, and the Civil War delivered the final blow, wiping out many peacetime projects along with it. But to understand why the U.S. Army decided to purchase dozens of camels from the Middle East in the first place, we need to go back almost 20 years before any of this happened. The first proposals to use camels came long before the experiment ever began. As early as 1837, and again on April 26, 1843, Army Captain George Henry Crossman put forward a formal proposal to the War Department to deploy camels as pack animals in the desert regions of the American West. He was among the first officers to point out an obvious fact. The deserts of North America closely resembled the conditions of the Middle East and North Africa, where camels had been the primary means of transport for thousands of years. But at the time, the idea seemed too far-fetched. Military leadership showed virtually no interest, and that might have been the end of it, had history itself not changed the situation a few years later. In 1848, 2 events occurred that completely transformed the position of the United States. Following victory in the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. Under its terms, the U.S. gained more than 1.5 million square kilometers of new territory. The future states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and significant portions of several other modern states all entered the Union at once. Almost simultaneously, the famous California gold rush began. Thousands of settlers poured westward across the deserts. The Army suddenly faced an entirely new challenge. Roads had to be built, remote garrisons supplied, wagon trains escorted, unknown lands surveyed, all while maintaining order across a vast territory home to tens of thousands of Native Americans. And it was here that a serious problem revealed itself. The U.S. Army had been built for entirely different conditions. The backbone of its transport was horses, mules, and wagons. But in the deserts of the Southwest, these quickly became a constant source of problems. Troops were forced to move from one watering hole to the next. A huge portion of every load consisted of water barrels and feed for the animals themselves. The farther a unit pushed out, the more supplies it had to carry just to keep moving. It was a vicious circle with no easy way out. Meanwhile, the local Native Americans moved through this harsh country with ease. They found hidden water sources, got by on minimal supplies, and could cover up to 100 miles a day in terrain where army columns barely crawled forward. The American military needed a fundamentally different solution. And the more officers studied the problem, the more often their attention turned to one animal that had already been solving exactly this kind of challenge for thousands of years in the harshest deserts on Earth: the camel. But a good idea alone wasn't enough. What was needed was someone who could turn it into a government program. And that someone appeared before long. His name was Jefferson Davis, senator from Mississippi, future president of the Confederacy, and at that moment, one of the most influential voices in American politics on matters of the military. During the Mexican-American War, he'd seen firsthand the difficulties troops faced in desert terrain. Vast distances, scorching heat, scarce water, and constant supply problems turned even small expeditions into grueling ordeals. So when the camel idea surfaced again, Davis didn't see exotic novelty. He saw a solution to one of the Army's most pressing logistical problems. As a senator, he made two attempts, in 1851 and again in 1852, to push funding for the project through Congress. Both times he failed. Newspapers mocked the proposal openly, and some congressmen joked outright that the next logical step would be purchasing elephants or ostriches for the American Army. The idea seemed dead and buried. But fate had a very different path in store for Jefferson Davis. In 1853, President Franklin Pierce appointed him Secretary of War of the United States. The man who had spent years failing to convince Congress now sat at the head of the War Department himself. With the power to make decisions, Davis returned to his old project almost immediately. He was convinced that opening up the new Western territories was impossible without a fundamentally different means of transport. At the time, the vast expanses of what are now Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona were commonly referred to as the Great American Desert. To most people living in the eastern states, these lands seemed barely fit for human habitation. But the Army had no choice. It had to operate there regardless. If horses couldn't handle these conditions, then a replacement had to be found. What makes this moment particularly striking is that one of Davis's closest advisors on the defense of Texas at this time was the temporary commander of the Texas Department, Colonel Robert Edward Lee. Within just a few years, these two men would end up on the same side of the barricades during the Civil War, becoming the defining symbols of the Confederacy. But at that moment, they were still working together on an entirely peaceful project, an attempt to bring into the American Army animals that most soldiers had never even laid eyes on. On March 3, 1855, Jefferson Davis's persistence finally paid off. Congress appropriated $30,000 to fund a full-scale experiment. By modern standards, that was a relatively modest sum, but it was enough to purchase the animals, ship them across the ocean, and run proper field trials. And so, the United States Camel Corps was officially born. Though in reality no separate corps existed yet, it was simply an experimental program of the U.S. Army, but it's under that name that it would enter the history books forever. 2 months later, on May 10, 1855, Davis signed one of the most unusual orders in the history of the American Army. He tasked Major Henry Constantine Wayne with sailing to the Mediterranean and acquiring the finest camels he could find. The choice was no accident. Wayne knew the problems of the southwestern territories firsthand. During the war with Mexico, he'd personally dealt with the nightmare of supplying troops in desert terrain and was one of the most committed advocates for using camels. In many ways, Wayne was the project's chief military architect. But buying the animals was only half the job. They still had to be safely transported across the Atlantic Ocean, and no one had any experience doing that. Nobody had ever shipped dozens of adult camels by sea over such a distance. This mission required a man with a very particular set of skills. That man was Navy Lieutenant David Dixon Porter. He would later become one of the most celebrated admirals of the Civil War. But in 1855, he was chosen for a very different reason. Porter had grown up in the Middle East, in the family of an American diplomat, and understood the nature of these animals well. He knew immediately that a standard transport ship was completely unsuitable for such an expedition. So before the voyage even began, the USS Supply underwent an extensive refit. On the upper deck, a spacious wooden enclosure nearly 18 meters long was constructed, with individual stalls for each animal. Special hatches were cut into the deck so the tallest camels' humps could clear the structure without difficulty. A new ventilation system was designed to channel fresh air directly into the stalls, and engineers developed custom suspension harnesses to keep the animals stable during heavy rolling and prevent serious injury. Even loading and unloading required a purpose-built lifting platform, a kind of camel elevator that had never existed before. Preparations took several weeks and became a small engineering experiment in their own right. Only when everything was ready could the expedition finally set out. Ahead lay thousands of kilometers of open sea, dozens of Mediterranean ports, and the search for animals that would go on to fill one of the most unusual pages in the history of the United States Army. On June 4, 1855, the USS Supply left the port of New York and set course across the Atlantic. But before meeting up with the ship, Major Henry Wayne had traveled to Europe separately. He faced a task no American officer had ever dealt with before. It wasn't simply a matter of buying camels. He needed to find the best camels, animals genuinely fit for military service. The first stop was England. Wayne spent several days at the London Zoo, studying the animals' behavior, their care, and their feeding requirements. He consulted with specialists from the Royal Zoological Society, questioned the keepers, and wrote down every detail that might prove useful later. The American Army was preparing to take on animals it knew almost nothing about. From there, the Major traveled to France. In Paris, he met with the country's Minister of War, Marshal Jean-Baptiste Vaillant. France had already been using camels successfully in North Africa for several years, and French officers were happy to share what they'd learned. It was there that Wayne gathered a wealth of practical advice on managing animals under military conditions. Those recommendations would later prove invaluable. Meanwhile, the USS Supply arrived in Italy, where Wayne joined her. From there, the real journey through the eastern Mediterranean began. Over the course of several months, the Americans traveled to the region's largest markets and caravan centers. They visited Tunisia, Egypt, Turkey, Malta, and Greece. At nearly every stop, they had to track down new sellers, inspect dozens of animals, and negotiate at length. The main goal was to assemble the most diverse herd possible. The military wanted to test which breeds would perform best in the American deserts. Not everything went smoothly. The most serious complications came in Egypt. Under local law, exporting camels without the personal permission of the ruler was strictly forbidden. The Egyptian viceroy flatly refused the Americans at first. He feared that making an exception for the United States would open the door to similar requests from diplomats of every other nation. The expedition risked losing access to the region's finest animals. So Henry Wayne turned to diplomacy. After lengthy negotiations, he presented the ruler with an unusual gift: 2 American mini rifles. The gesture proved exactly right. The ban was lifted. More than that, the viceroy personally authorized the sale of 10 camels to the Americans, 6 of which came from his own herd. That was a genuine stroke of luck. By the end of the voyage, the Americans had assembled a remarkably unusual collection of animals. 33 camels in total had been purchased: fast one-humped dromedaries, powerful two-humped Bactrians, 1 hybrid known as a nar, and 1 very young calf. The variety was entirely intentional. The Army still didn't know which breed would perform best in the conditions of the American Southwest. The experiment was meant to find out. Along with the animals, the Americans hired the people, without whom the entire project might have collapsed before it even started. Back in the United States, almost nobody knew how to handle a camel, so 8 experienced handlers from the Ottoman Empire and the Eastern Mediterranean agreed to make the journey. Most of them were Greek. Among them, one man stood out immediately, a man named Haji Ali. In America, his name would quickly be simplified into something more familiar: Hi Jolly. No one suspected at the time that this man would become the most recognized figure in the entire history of the United States Camel Corps and go on to become a genuine legend of the Wild West. But that was still a long way off. First came the most dangerous part of the expedition: transporting 3 dozen enormous animals across the Atlantic Ocean, each one weighing nearly a ton. And nobody could guarantee that even half of them would survive the crossing. On January 30th, 1856, the expedition completed loading the animals at the Turkish port of Smyrna, modern-day Izmir. Now the hardest part still lay ahead. 33 adult camels had to be transported across the Atlantic Ocean, animals that had never before been shipped by sea in such numbers. Even a perfectly prepared vessel couldn't guarantee success. Some of the camels had already spent nearly 5 months aboard before the open ocean crossing even began. Ahead lay almost 3 months of sailing through the Mediterranean and across the Atlantic. A serious outbreak of disease or a heavy storm could have ended the entire expedition right there. On February 15, 1856, the USS Supply raised anchor and set course for the United States. Despite several heavy storms, the crossing turned out far more successful than its organizers had dared to hope. The ventilation system, the purpose-built stalls, and the custom suspension harnesses that kept the animals stable during heavy rolling all proved their worth. The crew spent almost the entire voyage caring for their unusual passengers, feeding them, watering them, cleaning the stalls, and keeping constant watch over each animal around the clock. The work never stopped, day or night. The expedition did suffer one loss. A single camel died during the crossing. But almost immediately, something happened that no one had anticipated. One of the females gave birth right there on the ship. By the time the voyage was over, more animals arrived in America than had departed from Smyrna. The experiment seemed to be refusing to quit before it had even begun. On April 29th, the ship approached the Texas coast near the small port of Indianola. But getting the animals ashore immediately proved impossible. Heavy swells made any attempt at landing far too dangerous. It wasn't until May 14th that the sea finally calmed enough to begin unloading. And it was then that the Americans got their first real look at just how unusual their new charges actually were. When the camels felt solid ground under their feet after months at sea, the result was pure chaos. The animals reared up, bellowed loudly, pulled up their stakes, snapped their leads, and bolted up and down the beach as if celebrating their freedom. Henry Wayne later recalled that he had never in his life witnessed such an explosive display of joy from any animal. For the soldiers, it looked rather different. Suddenly they found themselves surrounded by dozens of enormous, deafeningly loud, and practically uncontrollable creatures. It took hours of exhausting work before every animal was gathered up and moved into the prepared enclosures. The American Army's first introduction to camels proved to be a deeply memorable one. The expedition had been so successful that Army leadership made a new decision almost immediately. Of the $30,000 appropriated by Congress, only about $8,000 had actually been spent. Enough remained to significantly expand the herd. Within weeks of the unloading, Jefferson Davis ordered David Dixon Porter to return to the Middle East. This time, the mission was even more ambitious. In early 1857, the USS Supply returned to the United States once more, carrying 41 additional dromedaries. During Porter's absence, some animals from the first group had died, but after the new arrivals, the Army's total camel count reached roughly 70 head. This was no longer simply a curious collection of exotic animals. It was becoming a fully operational experimental unit. Now came the time to answer the central question. Could camels actually transform the entire supply system of the United States Army? To find out, the military established a dedicated base at Camp Verde, roughly 60 miles north of San Antonio, in central Texas. This was where the experiment would begin, one watched with keen interest not just by the Army and Congress, but by the entire country. The task was no longer simply to house exotic animals. The military now had to answer the central question. Could camels become a genuine replacement for horses and mules across the American Southwest? Major Henry Wayne developed a comprehensive testing program to find out. Everything was put to the test. How much weight the animals could carry, how fast they could move, how many days they could go without water, what they preferred to eat, how they performed on long marches, how well they handled the heat, and whether they could work alongside the Army's horses and mules without causing chaos. It was one of the most ambitious logistical experiments the United States Army had ever undertaken. The first caravan set out along the route from Victoria to San Antonio to Camp Verde. Almost immediately, it became clear that many of Jefferson Davis's calculations had been correct. The camels handled multi-day marches under the blazing sun without difficulty. They browsed contentedly on tough, thorny scrub that mules refused to touch entirely. Where ordinary pack animals needed daily watering stops, the camels kept moving at virtually the same pace. But what impressed the military most was their carrying capacity. A standard Army mule carried around 250 pounds, just over 100 kilograms. Even the smaller dromedaries handled roughly 550 pounds with ease, more than double that load. Larger animals carried 700 to 800 pounds without strain, and over short stretches could manage loads approaching 1,000 pounds. Some of the more powerful Bactrians could carry weights approaching 3/4 of a ton. For an army that constantly struggled to supply its remote garrisons, numbers like these seemed almost unbelievable. But numbers alone proved nothing. So Wayne decided to put it to a direct test. In the fall of 1856, he organized a straightforward competition. 2 convoys left Camp Verde for San Antonio at the same time. One consisted of standard Army wagons pulled by mules. The other, just 6 camels. The route was identical. Travel times were carefully recorded. Every load was weighed in advance. When both convoys returned, the results were unambiguous. The camels hadn't just carried significantly more, they'd done it faster, with less effort, and using almost no additional water. The experiment made a powerful case for the project. Then came another round of trials. This time, the camels were tested alongside cavalry. During several extended marches, the animals carried food, fodder, and equipment for the soldiers and their horses. Officers watched closely to see whether they could keep pace with mounted columns. The result was, once again, unexpected. The camels kept up with the cavalry without difficulty. More than that, some officers noted that the animals actually had to be held back. Left to their own pace, they would have outwalked the entire column. For the army, this was yet another compelling piece of evidence that its new pack animals could genuinely transform the way troops were supplied. Buoyed by the results, Henry Wayne was convinced the experiment was closing in on its main goal. By the fall of 1856, he was writing to Washington that the camels had already proven their value not just to the army, but for civilian transport across the American West. Even Jefferson Davis had begun to hope that one day entire camel caravans would roll across the southwestern territories, moving cargo faster, cheaper, and farther than any conventional wagon train. To draw President James Buchanan's attention to the unusual project, Wayne sent Washington a rather remarkable gift: a pair of socks knitted by a Texas woman from the wool of one of the Army's camels. In the accompanying letter, the Major noted with mild irony that the gift was intended personally for the President. History never recorded whether the head of state ever actually wore camel wool socks. But the episode itself says a great deal about just how extraordinary this project looked, even to the people living through it. In January 1857, Major Henry Wayne left Camp Verde and returned to Washington. But before he departed, he left behind one important recommendation. If the Army wanted to truly convince Congress and the public, short trials around the camp weren't enough. What was needed was a real expedition through the most brutal terrain the Southwest had to offer. The War Department agreed. 25 camels were assigned to the new mission, both one-humped dromedaries and powerful Bactrians. To lead the expedition, they chose a man perfectly suited for the task: Edward Fitzgerald Beale. A former Navy lieutenant, explorer, cartographer, and seasoned frontier guide, Edward Fitzgerald Beale knew the western deserts well and had proven he could operate under brutal conditions. President James Buchanan tasked him with surveying and opening a wagon road from Fort Defiance in Arizona to the Colorado River, a route meant to connect the interior territories with California. To put the road to the test, Beale assembled a truly unusual caravan: 25 camels, 46 mules, and 250 sheep. On June 25, 1857, this strange procession left Camp Verde and headed west. Ahead lay one of the most punishing routes in the entire American Southwest. The expedition crossed the barren plains of Texas, climbed into the Sandia Mountains, pushed through the desert stretches of New Mexico and the high plateaus of Arizona, then descended into the scorching Mojave Desert, one of the hottest places in North America. If camels were going to prove their worth anywhere, it was here. The first few days left Beale largely unimpressed. Many of the animals had arrived with Porter's second shipment only recently and hadn't yet adjusted to the new conditions. Some were restless. Others refused to follow commands. The expedition's commander even began to wonder whether the military had overestimated what these exotic creatures could actually do. But 2 weeks later, his opinion had changed completely. With every passing day, the camels grew more impressive. They carried heavy loads of 750 to 1,000 pounds without complaint. They browsed contentedly on scrub and dry grass that mules barely touched. They needed almost no additional water. And what struck Beale most was that they always arrived in camp alongside the wagons, yet looked far less exhausted. He later wrote that he had never encountered anything so patient, so enduring, and so little trouble as these camels. Coming from a man who had doubted the project only weeks earlier, that was a remarkable endorsement. But the expedition's real test came in September 1857. Somewhere near the present-day town of Winslow, Arizona, the caravan found itself in a critical situation. A scout had taken a wrong route. The expedition had lost its bearings. The nearest known water source was some 20 miles away. The heat was unbearable. The mules were already beginning to drop from exhaustion. Soldiers broke out a small barrel of water and tried to get the animals to drink. What Beale witnessed next stayed with him for the rest of his life. The exhausted mules crowded frantically around the barrel, pressing toward the narrow opening as if they understood that without water they might not survive. The camels, meanwhile, stood calmly off to one side, chewing dry brush, looking as though nothing unusual was happening at all. The contrast was so striking that Beale called it one of the most remarkable sights of the entire expedition. The following morning, the mules had to be released. They bolted back at a gallop toward the last known watering point. The camels simply continued on their way, showing almost no signs of exhaustion. On October 18, 1857, the caravan reached the Colorado River. The expedition's primary objective had been accomplished, but Beale decided to push further. He led part of the animals into California, toward Fort Tejon, at the foot of the Sierra Nevada. Now the military had a new question to answer. Could the camels handle not just heat, but cold? The experiment continued under entirely different conditions, and by this point, Beale himself was certain of one thing. The Army had found a means of transport capable of transforming the entire supply system of the American Southwest. It was after this expedition that the idea of the Camel Corps reached the peak of its popularity. In Washington, serious discussions were no longer about dozens of camels. They were talking about hundreds, even thousands, for the United States Army. Edward Beale's expedition made a strong impression on military leadership. After it concluded, even many of the skeptics were forced to acknowledge the obvious. From a logistical standpoint, the camels had fully delivered on expectations. They carried significantly more than mules, handled the heat with ease, needed almost no access to water sources, and moved confidently through terrain where conventional wagon trains struggled badly. The next step seemed obvious: expand the program, purchase new animals, build out proper transport units. Some officials in Washington were already discussing exactly that scenario. The new Secretary of War, John B. Floyd, was particularly struck by the results. After receiving Beale's report, he declared that the suitability of camels for military operations on the plains could now be considered proven. In 1858, Floyd went to Congress with an ambitious proposal: funding for the purchase of 1,000 camels. This would have meant the experiment was no longer an experiment. Camels would have become a permanent fixture of the American Army. but Congress refused to allocate the funds. A year later, Floyd tried again. That attempt went nowhere too. The reason by now had nothing to do with the animals themselves. The political climate in the country was shifting rapidly. Questions that had seemed critically important only recently were being pushed aside. The United States was moving faster and faster toward the greatest internal crisis in its history. But even if Congress had approved new purchases immediately, the project already faced a different problem, one that proved far harder to solve. The soldiers simply did not like the camels. Troops quickly discovered that working with these animals was nothing like working with horses. Yes, the camels were extraordinarily tough, but they demanded a completely different kind of handling. If an animal sensed rough treatment or unfair punishment, it could refuse to cooperate for days, and sometimes it responded in its own particular way. An angry camel would often regurgitate its half-digested food directly onto whoever had offended it. Episodes like these quickly became favorite campfire stories among the soldiers. But for anyone on the receiving end of such an attack, there was nothing funny about it at all. There were plenty of other problems, too. Camels could bite without warning. They could kick without any sign of provocation. For handlers who had grown up in the Middle East, this behavior was perfectly familiar. American soldiers, however, experienced it as evidence of an almost unmanageable temperament. The smell of the animals caused particular irritation. Even officers admitted that many men simply never got used to it. But the worst of it fell on the Army's horses and mules. They reacted to the smell of camels with outright panic. Frightened animals shied away, refused to march alongside them, and sometimes threw entire caravans into chaos. For a mid-19th century army built around cavalry, this was a serious problem. Questions also arose about using camels in combat. Field trials made clear that not every idea that looked good on paper worked in practice. At first, the military seriously considered creating a camel cavalry. But testing showed the animals were far less suited to this role than horses. Due to the particular structure of their respiratory system, camels handled prolonged hard galloping and heavy physical exertion poorly. Under intense stress, they began to breathe heavily and sometimes extruded the soft palate sac, a natural physiological feature that looked genuinely alarming to anyone unfamiliar with these animals. They were also less maneuverable in close-quarters combat. It quickly became clear they could never replace cavalry horses. But that didn't mean the project had failed. Quite the opposite. Every trial only confirmed Jefferson Davis's original idea. The Army didn't need camels as combat animals. It needed them as supply animals. And in that role, they remained without equal. In 1861, the United States fractured. The Civil War had begun. Within months, almost every peacetime project lost its relevance. The armies of the North and South urgently needed weapons, men, money, and railroads. The camel experiment was nowhere near the top of anyone's priority list. It was at this moment that the fate of the unusual corps was effectively sealed. By the time war broke out, the federal herd had already been split. Around 80 animals were at Camp Verde in Texas. Another 30 were held at Fort Tejon in California. When Texas seceded from the Union, General David E. Twiggs handed over most of the state's military installations to Confederate forces. Along with the weapons, depots, and barracks, the Army's camels went with them. And so the most unusual animals in the American Army found themselves, quite unexpectedly, on the side of the Confederacy. The Confederates tried to make use of their unexpected acquisition. The Confederate Quartermaster Service did put the camels to work hauling supplies. Captain Sterling Price is known to have used one of them for nearly the entire war, carrying his company's equipment. But even here, the old problem never went away. Soldiers continued to dislike the animals. They still terrified horses, still resisted inexperienced handlers, and still demanded a completely different kind of management. On the other side of the country, the camel's fate was faring little better. The animals remaining in California continued performing small transport duties and carrying mail between military posts. But gradually, officers complained more and more about the difficulties of keeping them. The camels were called expensive, inconvenient, and useless. Following repeated complaints and a legal proceeding in which the animals were actually declared a public nuisance on account of their smell and their effect on horses, the government decided to abandon the experiment for good. On February 24, 1864, the remaining camels were sold at public auction. Most were purchased by circus owners. Some were bought by gold prospectors and farmers. Others ended up with private freight operators, and a handful were simply set free. And so the official history of the United States Camel Corps came to an end. But the story of the camels themselves was far from over. Among the men who had arrived with the first shipment of animals was an experienced handler named Haji Ali. His name struck Americans as too unfamiliar, and before long they simply called him Hi Jolly. He turned out to be the man who bound his life to the American West more deeply than many people born there. After the Army program was shut down, Hi Jolly did not return home. He kept working with camels, hauling freight between the Colorado River and the mining camps of Arizona, and later re-enlisted in the Army as a pack animal specialist during General George Crook's campaign against Geronimo. In 1880, he became an American citizen under the name Philip Tedrow, started a family, and became a permanent part of the story of the American West. When Hi Jolly died in 1902, he was buried in the small town of Quartzsite, Arizona. Several decades later, the townspeople erected an unusual monument over his grave, a stone pyramid crowned with a copper figure of a camel. In 2011, that memorial was added to the National Register of Historic Places, and today it stands as the most enduring reminder of a project that once seemed like a crazy idea. But there were other witnesses to this story, ones who left behind neither diaries nor photographs. Some of the camels that had been released or gone missing continued wandering the deserts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas for many years. Travelers, cowboys, and gold prospectors regularly reported encounters with feral animals. Such accounts kept appearing well into the early 20th century. The last known sighting dates to 1941, when witnesses near the town of Douglas in Texas reported spotting a lone camel. Perhaps it was the last descendant of Jefferson Davis's army, or perhaps it was simply a beautiful legend, one born from the story of the most unusual experiment in American military history. The story of the United States Camel Corps is often dismissed as a curiosity, a strange footnote, an Army's misguided attempt to replace horses with exotic animals. But look closely at the actual trial results, and something becomes clear. The experiment itself did not fail. Quite the opposite. The camels proved they could carry far more weight, cover enormous distances without water, and operate successfully in terrain where conventional transport constantly struggled. What killed the project wasn't the animals. It was timing. The country was racing toward civil war. Money was flowing into arming armies. The age of the railroad was beginning, and with it, the need to find an alternative to mules and wagons was disappearing. One can only wonder what the story of the American West might have looked like had Congress approved the purchase of 1,000 camels, and war not erased those plans. Perhaps caravans of ships of the desert would have become as familiar a part of the Arizona and Texas landscape as cowboys, stagecoaches, and railroad trains. It never happened, and that is precisely why the story of the United States Camel Corps remains one of the most extraordinary pages in American military history. The story of a project that was ahead of its time, proved its own worth, and still lost to circumstances that no one could change.